Hello, I'm Graham Horton and welcome to today's video. Now I was going through some paperwork when you do one of these great tidying up exercises you sometimes do, and I found the original purchase receipt for my Panasonic Lumix FZ200. Now I bought this exactly 10 years ago, so I thought I'd do a little review of the camera in 2022. Now I still use this camera and I use it mainly for tabletop, as this camera seems to excel in close range and high magnification. So with the combined f2.8 lens and the ability to go quite close with macro or even using a macro lens, I get some fantastic pictures. So I actually use this for tabletop photography. Now when I reviewed this camera in 2012, I got a lot of flack, particularly from some of the forums like DP Review. Now when I reviewed this, I said that this camera was going to be a game changer for the fact that with having that constant aperture f2.8 lens, it had a very competitive advantage over similar cameras. It meant that in low light you could still use that bright wide f2.8 aperture even at the extension of 600mm effective focal length. Most cameras at that time were stopping down to f5.9, so you were getting at least 2 stops worth of light gathering ability with this camera. So you're getting effectively 2 stops less noise with the equivalent sensor. So I really liked it for that purpose, and a lot of people said it was a rubbish and I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, 10 years on, I know who's right and I know who's wrong. I love this camera and a lot of other people love this camera too. Now there are a couple of issues with this camera which I don't like, but they were addressed with the incremental change to the FZ300 or 330 camera, so all was well with that. So this is a 1/2/3" sensor camera, and if you notice the effective focal length goes from the native 4.5 to 108mm. So it's a 4.5 to 108mm lens that's in the camera, but we normally refer to this in its 35mm equivalence. Now the effective focal length is calculated by using what's called the crop factor, and the crop factor itself is the ratio of the diameter of this sensor compared to the diameter of a full frame sensor or full frame film, which is 36 by 24mm. If you compare this sensor, which is 6.17 by 4.5mm, you can calculate the crop factor. Now that works out to effectively 5.4. Now the way Panasonic calculates it is by using the diagonal of each of the aspect ratios. Now the aspect ratio of the native sensor in this camera is 4:3, and as you know, the aspect ratio of a full frame sensor or full frame film is actually 3:2. So really you should be using the 3:2 equivalence of the sensor to compare it to full frame equivalence. But Panasonic use a diagonal of each of the crop factors, so you'll find that the effective focal length changes dependent on the actual aspect ratio. So the 4:3 is different to the 3:2, which is different to 6:9. But we know, and I've argued this many times on my blog, the field of view doesn't actually change. We always use the full width of the sensor. So we're using the 3000 pixels wide image, apart from the 1:1 where we're using 2992 by 2992. The rest of the format uses the full 3000 pixel wide image. So all we're doing is cropping the top and bottom of the image to achieve the right aspect ratio. So therefore, if the image width doesn't change, the focal length doesn't change. So it's nonsense to suggest, in my opinion, that the focal length is changing with the different aspect ratios, and I've got many examples where I've proved that. Consider the depth of field gathered by this camera compared to a full frame camera. We know depth of field depends on 3 variables. The first is obviously the aperture of the lens, the second one is the distance of the subject to the sensor plane, and the third one is the focal length of the lens. So if I set this camera to 25mm effective focal length, so we're using that 4.5mm native lens, multiplying that by the crop factor to give us our 25mm. If I were to set the aperture to f2.8, and I then compared that to the image gathered by a full frame camera set to 25mm focal length, and the f2.8 kept the same distance of the subject to the sensor, you would find that the FZ200 apparently looks as though it's gathering more depth of field. In fact, it's gathering 5.4 times more depth of field than your full frame camera. And in fact, if you wanted to capture the same depth of field with your full frame camera as the image captured by the FZ200, you would have to stop down by 5.4 times, effectively f16 on the full frame camera, to get the same depth of field as you're getting with the f2.8 aperture of the FZ200. So you can see it's why we get tremendous depth of field even at f2.8. Now that can be an advantage for things like macro or tabletop photography, but it's a disadvantage if you want to shoot portraits, because you're not going to be able to create those creamy background blurry pictures that you can with the wider apertures on a larger sensor camera. To achieve those blurry backgrounds, you need to be able to use a longer focal length, keep the camera as close to the subject as you can, and then keep the subject as far away from the background as you can to simulate that nice bokeh. It is possible to achieve some great portraits with this camera. I've done that many times with the camera. Here's a picture taken with the FZ200, again with a longer focal length. You can see the amount of resolution you get with this camera. It's ideal for portraits. So that hopefully clears up the reason why even with the f2.8 aperture you'll find that you're getting extreme depth of field, and it's hard to overcome that unless you're using the longer focal lens. We also know that the smaller sensor cameras produce more noise at the higher ISOs. So effectively, when I set this camera to ISO 100, which is its lowest native ISO, if you multiply that ISO by the crop factor squared, you end up with something like ISO 3200 equivalents on a full frame camera. So if I set my full frame camera to ISO 3200, I have the same focal length, I have the same aperture, you'll notice that there's the same amount of noise at ISO 3200 in the full frame camera as you're getting with this camera at ISO 100. So you can see the larger format sensors actually give you an advantage in noise reduction. If you reduce the aperture, you're going to get 5.4 times less noise with that camera than you do with the FZ100. So with the larger sensor cameras, you can actually reduce your ISO and get far cleaner pictures than you can ever get with the FZ200, even at its lowest aperture of f2.8. When I first reviewed this camera, I said one of the most outstanding features was the fact that in manual mode, this camera gives you a graphical user interface showing you the distance to your subject, but also the amount of depth of field. So it was great for what we call hyperfocal distance settings. You can set this camera to give you the maximum depth of field for any distance you've set and any aperture and focal length. So let me demonstrate that. Looking at the side of the camera, you can see we've got a slide switch, and if you put that in the lower position, you've got the manual focus. If you turn the camera around and look at the back, if you use the top control dial here, if you now move that left or right, you'll bring up the focus scale, and you can see the focus scale goes from 0.01 meters to infinity, and that yellow band will indicate the amount of depth of field that you've got. So if I change the focus point to a point nearer, sorry, I pressed the focus button on the side. If I move this to a point nearer, you can see that the depth of field will decrease. So the closer you get to your subject, the depth of field will decrease, and the further away, the depth of field will increase. And that will of course depend on the distance to your subject, and it will also depend on the focal length. So if I just change the focal length, I go to a slightly longer telephoto distance, so we'll go to times 4, and then again if I turn the back control dial, you can see that the depth of field indicator has gone much smaller. So you can see we've got a shallow depth of field with the telephoto setting. So at 100 millimeters, you can see we've got a very nice shallow depth of field. If you wanted to change the manual focus position, when you've got the manual focus scale up, if you press menu set, it allows you to use the cursor buttons now to change the position for where the camera will actually use for your enlarged view when you're changing manual focus. Whilst you're in manual focus, if you want the camera to automatically focus for you to get you close to that point, there is a button on the side of the lens barrel marked focus. So even if I'm a long way away out of focus, you can see that on that image there we're out of focus. If I press the focus button, the camera will focus for you, give you the indication you've got focus lock, you've got the green rectangle which shows you the locks that occurred, and you've got the dot on the right hand side of the screen to show you've got focus lock. So if you want that facility where you can autofocus in manual mode, just press that AF button on the side of the barrel while we're in the manual mode. Now there are a couple of issues with the camera that I pointed out at the time of review. Most of those were addressed with the upgrade of the FZ300-330. The first one was the EVF of the camera, which was just a plastic housing. Now if you wear glasses like I do, it's quite possible that you might have been able to scratch the coating of your glasses with this being pressed up against your eye. So the modification I made at the time was to glue a rubber eye cup from the Nikon DK20, or it's the DK20 eye cup for the Nikon cameras. I just used super glue to glue that onto the EVF, and that now gives me a nice soft rubber to put against my eye or against my glasses, and it gives you a nice seal if you're in bright sunlight, that you can see the image in the EVF much clearer. So there is an entry on my photographic blog, and I'll put a link to it in the description below, and if you wanted to mount that, you can see how it's done with the Nikon DK20 rubber housing. It's still available on Amazon and eBay. Now the second feature I didn't like was the actual red record button, which is just underneath this little plastic jewel that I fitted. It meant that if you're in the PAS mode, then to start recording video you just press the red record button, but it was difficult to find that button initially, so I glued on here a little plastic jewel, one of these self-adhesive craft store jewels. Just place that onto the button, and that gave me an immediate tactile feel for that button if I was in the PAS mode and I wanted to quickly shoot video. Obviously if you're in the manual mode, then you're using the traditional shutter button to start and stop recording. So if you want to add that feature to your camera, then just put one of those little jewels on there to assist you to find that button. The other annoying feature is the self timer. It cancels every time you take a shot. So self timer you can set to 2 seconds, then when you take the picture it will take it after that 2 seconds, but now that 2 seconds has been reset. So if I go back to the timer mode, you'll see that it's gone back to off, and there's no way to change that. You constantly had to keep going back to 2 seconds and take it. Now the only way around that, if you're using it on a tripod, is of course to use the remote shutter, which plugs into the socket on the side here, that 2.5mm socket. And that was the other annoyance, I guess, was the fact that it hadn't got a standard 3.5mm microphone input. It was a 2.5mm. It shared the socket with the remote control, so you had to use a 2.5 to 3.5mm adapter, or use the very expensive Panasonic MS1 microphone, which had a 2.5mm plug on it. Eventually I cut the plug off a 3.5 and attached a 2.5, so I had my own option for this camera. But again, normally you would have to use a 2.5 to 3.5mm adapter, which meant sometimes you introduce more noise as that camera moves around or the lead moves around. What I did like was the fact that if you wanted to replay this onto a full-size television, it had a mini HDMI output rather than some of the other cameras which had micro HDMI. So you've got a mini HDMI socket on the side to play your pictures back. So there are several features which make this camera quite useful for serious amateurs. We've got all the facilities of the PASM mode, you've got the f2.8 bright aperture, you've got the facility to add an external microphone for video recording, external hot shoe here for adding extra flash or flash triggers, and a tilt and turn LCD, which is fantastic if you're doing selfies or you're low to the ground and want to be able to see what you're shooting, or high up and point down. So the effect of having a now tiltable screen was a big benefit for me. So there we are, that's the FZ200, 10 years on from its release date and still producing some fantastic images. There are a few battle scars on the camera. You may notice there on the lens, just in the center, there is a piece of the coating missing. Don't know when that occurred, but it has just marked the surface coating, but it doesn't affect the images in any way. I did have dust on the inside of this at one point, but I did a video of how to remove the front element and clean the inside of the front element and the first element of the lens itself. So you do get dust in there. It's not like the FZ300, which has dust sealing. You can actually remove that front element and clean it. The other issue I had with the camera was the back control dial, which failed a number of years ago, but that complete assembly is available. Again, I'll put a link to that in the video description below, and I did a video on how you can actually replace that. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it can be done. The switch is now increased in price to about £25, so if you wanted to do that repair yourself, you can do it for about £25. So that's the FZ200. Beautiful little camera, and I like it in many ways. And the FZ300 with its new housing, slightly better resolution EVF and touchscreen for the LCD made it a worthwhile upgrade from the FZ200. But image quality wise, there's very little difference between the 300 and this, as it has the same lens effectively and it has the same sensor. So that's it for the review. Thanks very much for watching, and of course if you're a new viewer and like what you see, why not hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. So until the next video, thanks again for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all very, very soon. Goodbye for now.